I'd like to welcome everyone to Hiawatha in History and Legend. I am Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. And as you noted, this program is being recorded and will be posted on the 55 Plus YouTube channel as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that she will be the only one appearing in the actual recording. Today, in honor of Native American Heritage Month, we will learn about Hiawatha, a real Native American leader who was immortalized in Longfellow's 1855 poem, The Song of Hiawatha. Mary McCutcheon, a former professor at George Mason University, will discuss Hiawatha's significance in history. Mary McCutcheon taught in the George Mason University Anthropology Department from 1988 to 2004. Before that, Ms. McCutcheon worked at the Smithsonian in the Directorate of International Affairs, and prior to that, she taught at the University of Guam. In retirement, Ms. McCutcheon conducts research on land and marine resource ownership in the Palau Islands of Micronesia. She also studies the surge of religiosity in our society. We're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. Please feel free as we go along to enter your questions in the chat, but we will address them at the end. And of course, if you prefer to use the raise hand function in Zoom, that's an option. And also, once we get through all the questions that have come in the chat and with people who've raised their hand, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the program over to our speaker, Mary McCutcheon.
So here's Hiawatha. Hiawatha, neither American poetry nor the Iroquois people have ever been a subject of my own research, but I've become interested in things where literature and legend and influence kind of come together and cause us to stop and think of why something like Hiawatha becomes iconic in our society. So let me move ahead, and I'm hoping the timing is right. I have to keep myself from babbling too much. So let's start. Hiawatha, and the title is now Literature, History, Influence, whatever you want it to be. And I'm going to scroll forward. Here's Hiawatha's immortal poem with illustrations by Frederick Remington, but please don't look too closely. This is actually a parody of the poem, but I picked it out because of Frederick Remington's beautiful illustrations. So I'd like to start with the rhythmic nature of Hiawatha. You're probably all familiar with some of the classics like By the Shores of Gitche Gumee, By the Shining Deep Sea Water, Stood the Wigwam of Nokomis, Daughter of the Moon Nokomis. It's called trochaic tetrameter. So Longfellow composed this in 1855. It reads very much like a lullaby. In fact, if any of you are suffering from insomnia, my recommendation is read this aloud to you before you go to bed, and you'll fall right asleep. Okay, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, he was born in Portland, Maine in 1807. His family really promoted education. Both his mother and his father were highly educated people at that time, and they sent him to Bowdoin College, where he excelled in linguistics. He was so gifted in languages that when he graduated, I believe he was only 18 when he graduated from Bowdoin, the college said, look, go to Europe and learn a few more languages and come back and we'll give you a great, fabulous job. He did go to Europe. He studied German, French, Swedish. I can't remember. He traveled all over Europe, picking up languages like a sponge. So at the end of his language learning trip, Bowdoin said, okay, we're going to offer you the job we promised, but at a reduced salary. And he said, forget it then. He really stood up for himself, and he got a job at Harvard instead. And he wrote poetry on the side. So what did he write? Here are some of the best known. You've probably at one point or another been exposed to all of these poems. And then there are a few that are shorter and philosophical and very, very moving. What is the common theme we see in Longfellow's poetry? I think there's a passionate patriotism. In the early 19th century, he was very fond of American history and American tradition, and very idealistic too. So the of minorities in his poetry is something I think we should pay attention to. Evangeline is about an oppressed minority group, and it's quite a moving story about the Cajuns, and of course Hiawatha is a story that celebrates Native American history and culture. As I'll point out later on, his facts aren't quite right, but still the idealism is there nonetheless. Pretty soon he got sick of teaching. Even at Harvard, he got sick of teaching, and he decided to quit in 1854. And here's what he said about quitting his job. I am in a perpetual state of exasperation at seeing my life corroded by such petty cares, so that nothing of any value can come out of it. Perpetual writing of letters and writing of autographs and doing petty things for petty people. And when he walked out of his last classroom, he said, I am now free. Well, what was he free to do? This was 1854. He quit his job, and it was right away. He threw himself headfirst into Hiawatha. Okay, at first, he had this inspiration to make this about an Ojibwa. By the way, let me say something about terms for Native American tribes. You may have heard of the Chippewa. Ojibwa is the same thing as the Chippewa, but neither of those words is the correct word for the tribe, which is now known as the Anishinaabe, both in Canada. I think both in Canada and the US. I'm not actually sure, but I think the Anishinaabe is the correct word. Still, I'm going to use Ojibwa because it's so much more commonly known. So who's this character he wanted to create a story about? Manebojo, an Ojibwa sacred rabbit. Somehow that doesn't seem quite right. But it just occurred to me, pretty soon I'm going to be referring to Bugs Bunny. But it just occurred to me, never mind. We'll get to that in a minute. The trouble with Manebojo is it's not a very mellifluent word. And he decided he didn't like that very much, but Hiawatha sounded a lot better. The two stories of Manebojo, the Ojibwa traditional mythology, has nothing to do with Hiawatha, but that didn't bother Longfellow too much, because I think he figured you could conflate these Native American traditions and pretty much get away with it. Where did he get his idea from the Ojibwa people? From this guy whose name is Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. In the early 19th century, he lived in, I think, upper Michigan, somewhere along Lake Superior, and he married a woman whose father was white and mother was Ojibwa, and people accuse him of just listening to his wife tell stories, and he took notes instead of doing honest ethnography. I think that's probably not fair, but his wife was an accomplished poet also. Just an aside about Schoolcraft. His work is well respected, considering it was early 19th century, or probably because it was early 19th century. The stories he heard and the ethnographic descriptions that he wrote down were probably as close to true for pre-contact Native Americans as you could get. when his wife died, he remarried a woman who was also a writer. But this woman, his next wife, was a slavery apologist. And her work that she wrote around the middle of the 19th century was a response to Harriet Beecher Stowe, the romantic, happy version of slavery. There was a whole literary movement at that time. It does make you wonder about Schoolcraft himself. Why would he have married a woman like that? But that's another subject. Never mind. Let's move along. The other influence that Longfellow had at this time that made him sort of romanticize Native Americans was an encounter with a guy who was also Anishinaabe Ojibwa, who came to Boston and hung out with Longfellow. This guy is named Kage Gagabo, and he was kind of a, maybe you'd call him a diplomat for Ojibwa peoples and cultures. And he traveled to Europe and went around talking about his tribe and the plight of the Native Americans, and gaining quite a lot of respect and sympathy. In addition to this, Longfellow encountered a couple of other Native Americans, including a Dakota chief who showed up at Boston Common, just kind of presenting ideas about Native Americans, and cultivating some sympathy among the liberal, sort of pre-Civil War elite of Boston. It was effective. So another thing about Schoolcraft I want to say is, we know that Longfellow wrote Hiawatha in 1855. Schoolcraft was, I guess, really mad, and he wrote a book called The Myth of Hiawatha in 1856. And I haven't read it, but I ordered it from Amazon and it hasn't arrived yet, so stay tuned. Maybe it'll be an interesting kind of response to Longfellow. It's certainly not well known, like who ever heard of Schoolcraft's Myth of Hiawatha, but it's probably based on the actual myth, which is an Iroquois story of Hiawatha. Anyway, here's where Manebojo / Hiawatha was supposed to have taken place. This is the south shore of Lake Superior on the Michigan Upper Peninsula. This is a very beautiful part of the country and full of mythological connections, a lot of history. Everything is Anishinaabe, though. The Iroquois people had nothing to do with this part of the country, but gives you an idea of the picture rocks and the shores of, I guess, is this supposed to be Gitchigumi? I'm not quite sure. Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Where am I now? Okay, here I'm going to show you a map of where this area was supposed to take place. This is the south shore of Lake Superior, and this is the state of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. And this over here would be Minnesota. So this is the country the Anishinaabe / Ojibwa Chippewa live in now. Now this is the area where the real Hiawatha came from. So there's a long way between one and the other. But this is the country he's talking about. Right at this point, I'm going to tell you what the poem Hiawatha is all about. I'm just going to read aloud from my summary in case you haven't read it, which I can understand. But if you read it as a cure for insomnia, you won't remember what's in it anyway. So here goes. The Great Spirit, Gitchimanito, calls the leaders of Indian nations together to tell them to join forces and terminate all enemies. And no more warfare, from now on, unity. Nokomis is the daughter of the moon, and her daughter Winona is seduced by the west wind, Mujikiwis, and bears a baby, Hiawatha. The west wind blows away and Winona dies of grief. and the baby is raised by Nokomis. The west wind is a deadbeat dad, so Hiawatha goes out to tell him off. Epic battles ensue, and Hiawatha succeeds in chasing the old man farther west. The old man was just testing him and rewards the son with special instructions to go rid the world of its evils. So he gets redeemed. The deadbeat dad turns out to be a good guy after all. So Hiawatha does all this. He discovers corn agriculture, invents writing and a system of justice, and he marries the love of his life, the Dakota beauty Minnehaha. After a while, everyone close to him dies, and a great famine leaves the place desperate. A traveler goes to the east and returns bearing fateful news. There is a lot of salty water out there to the east, and there's some huge canoes that are approaching, carrying men with white faces and beards. Hiawatha says this confirms his vision. So by and by along come the Catholic missionaries, and Hiawatha ushers them in and instructs everyone to heed what they say. However, he has some reservations, and let me read to you a little bit about the end of the story. Just kind of this part is puzzling because it doesn't fit the trope. We kind of don't want the Catholic missionaries to have such a prominent role in this book. Okay, here's what Hiawatha says about the arrival of the Catholic missionaries. Let us welcome them, the strangers, hail them as our friends and brothers, and the heart's right hand of friendship give them when they come to see us. Gitchimanato the mighty said this to me in my vision. But here comes the darker vision that he has. Then a darker, drearier vision passed before me, vague and cloud-like. I beheld our nation scattered, all forgetful of my counsels, weakened, warring with each other, saw the remnants of our people sweeping westward, wild and woeful, like the cloud rack of the tempest, like the withered leaves of autumn. So this is 23 years after the Trail of Tears. And I think many liberal and compassionate Eastern intellectuals saw the Trail of Tears as just a devastating blow to humanitarianism. And we're also in the dawn of the build-up to the Civil War, a time when people like Longfellow and everyone he knew were very strongly abolitionist. So the plight of minority people in the Americas was something kind of high on their minds. Okay, the book was done. 1855, it comes out. Now, I'm not sure that Frederick Remington illustrated the first edition or not. My copy is illustrated by Frederick Remington, and the illustrations themselves were the price of the book. But I actually don't know what the first edition had in the way of illustrations. Never mind, it sold like hotcakes. People went crazy buying this book. Let me move on to the next slide. All right. It resonated with people so much. Why? And here are my kind of what do you call it, deconstructing breakdown of what I thought that this book had that meant so much to people in 1855. First of all, it's about unity. It's about dignity for everyone. There's a prophecy of a messianic hero who goes on a hero's journey quest to find out the truth and to bring his people into a future that is more promising. Of course, there's romance with Minnehaha. There's redemption. Even the bad guys are redeemed. Even the West Wind gets his chance to show that he's come around. It gives hope, and it expresses a nuanced view of the white missionaries. So here is why the popularity is expressed in so many ways. Here is, let me see, wait a second. This one in the top. This is a film that was done. I thought I had an image of the film that was done in 1909, an actual moving silent picture cast by Ojibwa actors. And you can't get a hold of this thing. However, in 1919, I think, there was a film that you can see now on YouTube that is just a short little thing. I can't have to admit I haven't watched it. Here are, wait a second, is this the right? I guess this is the right slide. Here are some illustrations, paintings. Here's a sculpture by St. Gaudens of Hiawatha, just showing a kind of pensive, tragic figure here. Naturally, we have to have comic books. We have to have trains that are called, this is called the Hiawatha route or something like that. But here's a bike route that happens not even to be in Michigan. It's up in Montana or someplace. Now, this is an opera. I just picked a bit of the score out because this is worth pointing out. Samuel, you've probably heard of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the great addict of laudanum who composed so many poems in the 19th century. Well, here's a woman who had a baby whose last name was Coleridge, and she named him Samuel Coleridge Taylor. The father of this baby was a Sierra Leonean who came to London and got this British woman pregnant, and he went back to Sierra Leone before the baby was born. So the baby was born half Sierra Leonean black and half British white. And in the beginning of the 19th century, this had to have been interesting. But the child was a musical genius and pursued his interest in music by writing lots of things. I think he was a conductor. I think he was played instruments. And here's the opera that he composed called The Song of Hiawatha. When he himself had a baby, he named his child Hiawatha. And I think there's something that resonated with him about the Hiawatha story, because he also had a father who abandoned him. And he probably wanted subconsciously to redeem his own father. Okay, now we have, oh yeah. This is the picture I thought I had before. Here's the 1909 film with the Ojibwa actors. And here's Disney's Little Hiawatha. Of course, I watched that because that takes only a few minutes, and you can see it on YouTube. Here's a 1952 film that was very popular, but there was backlash because it represented Native Americans in a compassionate way, and somehow McCarthy saw communism in this thing, and he blacklisted the producer. He blacklisted all kinds of people because of allegedly communist idea. And here's of course, the rabbit has to come up again. Naturally, Bugs Bunny has to figure into the Hiawatha recount. So what do we have in common here? None of these films, I believe, none of them actually have anything to do with the story that Longfellow wrote. They're all just taking off in different directions. The one thing they have in common is there's Native Americans, period. And there's a few other things that they have in common too. They are all about a spirit quest. Even this Little Hiawatha, Walt Disney, now not so much the rabbit, but this Little Hiawatha is on a spirit quest and ends up finding truth and virtue. This, I believe this, which I haven't watched, but the other ones from this time period are about the the search for something and redemption, and a lot of the themes of the poem Hiawatha do come up in these films, even though the story is completely different. They're about an unlikely hero who gets chosen because of prophecy, expresses kindness and mercy, and they all have a happy ending. And this little Disney one is sort of worth watching because it's about how the animals love him, and that the animals reward him for his kindness to animals, and save his life in the end. So I think it's fun to see how something like a poem that was wildly popular when it came out becomes transformed over time. Okay, there's the end of part 1. How's my time? Not bad. Okay, here's the end. That's the end of part 1. Now we're going to go to who in the world was Hiawatha in real life or in Iroquois legend, and why it sort of doesn't matter what Longfellow had to say about Hiawatha. There are some common themes, but not much more than that. There was a Hiawatha. Hiawatha was probably a historic character. And one might say, okay, when did this historic character who united the tribes of the Iroquois under a confederacy, when did this happen? Everyone always loves to look at celestial events, like, oh, well, let's see. I know, there was a solar eclipse in 1142 that would have been seen in the northeastern part of the American continent. So, oh, that must have been it. Well, that's too long ago. That's kind of improbable that it would have been that long ago, but highly probable that the real historic Hiawatha lived in the 16th century. Okay, in the 1500s, lots of stuff was happening in the East Coast. Well, not just the East Coast, of course, the Southwest and the South too, as European explorers and colonists began to come in. We always think Jamestown and Plymouth were very, very early in colonial history. Not so. There was a whole lot going on right in the aftermath of Columbus's voyages. You got Spaniards coming in all directions, including up in Virginia. You may not know that there was a Spanish colony along the Chesapeake Bay in the middle of the 16th century, like 1560s. And they were taking Native Americans back to Europe by the armloads. There's one guy who was taken from the Chesapeake Bay back to Spain, taught Spanish, and returned with the Spaniards in their colony to help them get adjusted. Of course, he turned coat on them and slaughtered them all, but that's another story. Why then would people pretty far away from the coast have developed a prophetic messianic leader at this time? I believe that almost nowhere in North America were native tribes unfamiliar or ignorant of what Europeans were doing, even in the 16th century. I think the word spread. I think technology and metal tools and horses and domesticated pigs and all sorts of stuff was spreading. And I think word filtered up to the Iroquois probably in the 16th century that some sort of funny business was going on the coasts. Not only that, I believe that diseases spread before the actual people, before the actual Europeans spread. So here we have a situation where there's a fear of outsiders and a desire to protect what we have through unity. And the Confederacy that I'm going to be talking about in a minute emerged as an effort to unify in the face of a common enemy. The tribes in the Chesapeake area did this too, and we call that the Powhatan Confederacy. And that was happening before Jamestown, because of the rumors that stuff was happening that might require that we unify. Okay, the Iroquois people then. We anthropologists like to call the Iroquois people, give them a unity because of common linguistic affiliations. The Iroquoian language family was spoken by the 5 tribes that ended up confederating, as well as the Huron, as well as the Susquehannocks, as well as the Tuscarora, and the Cherokee also down in North Carolina and Georgia spoke Iroquoian languages. So it was a very widespread language family. Not everybody got along. In fact, the whole problem was they were quarreling and squabbling with each other, and there were very serious wars, lots and lots of bloodshed. Most significantly, the New York Iroquois against the Cherokee people. But the Tuscarora in the eastern part of North Carolina remained allied with their New York State fellow language speakers. Just as an aside, getting back and forth between the Finger Lakes of New York and Western North Carolina and Georgia might seem like a really long, arduous trip. But throughout pre-contact time of in the eastern United States, there were trails, there were pathways that connected all kinds of groups of people, all the way from Florida into the central southern states like Louisiana and Mississippi, thoroughfares basically, no horses and no wheels even, and yet people traveled up and down the coast and back and forth all the way to the Mississippi River pretty much without any obstructions. But there were wars, of course. In fact, the trail that connected the Iroquois people with the Finger Lake, New York people is called the Great Warpath. So when you say, oh, he's on the warpath, there really was a such thing as the warpath, except it was also a pathway for transmission of materials and news and exchanging spouses and trade. And where is this warpath? If you go to the Shenandoah Valley and go along Route 11, I think it parallels Interstate 81. That's the warpath. That was the route that was paved by the Europeans on the grounds of the Native American route map. Okay, the Haudenosaunee is the proper name for the Iroquois people, and it means the people of longhouses. And here is a reconstructed longhouse, showing you that it really is a longhouse, and there's a lot of activities going on outside. A lot of families lived in a longhouse, but they were related to each other through their mother's line. So let's say you have a matriarch and she has a bunch of children. Her daughters stay at home in the longhouse with their husbands. That's called matrilocal postmarital residence, where the husbands move in with the wife, and then they raise their family. And you might have 3 or 4 generations of female-based extended families going on in there. This inside of a longhouse, this is a reconstructed one. There are fire pits, because it gets cold in upper New York State, like seriously cold. And so they had to have fire pits in the house that were ventilated through smoke holes in the roof, I think. But it might have been pretty gloomy in there and also very smoky in there. But here's where people slept, and households would have shared these sleeping benches I mean, by that, I mean nuclear families, a husband and wife and their children, so that you have multiple nuclear families living in this one long extended family household. That's the way I understand it. And this would be what a village cluster would look like, surrounded by palisades. So lots and lots of long houses together. Now, where were these taking place? The map before showed this, but here's the better map that shows the related languages. Wenro, that's the Huron people. And here are the 5 tribes that united under Hiawatha. And down below, you've got the Tuscarora and the Cherokee people linked by common languages up and down the coast. These are the not Iroquoian language speaking people along here, Algonquian speaking languages. Okay, where are we going to go from here? All right, the legend of Hiawatha, which we don't know where legend ends and history begins, because all history was orally transmitted until there was a writing system. That didn't happen until the Europeans arrived. But people respect that oral tradition. There's a lot of probably truth that comes through oral histories, except some of it has to be conflated with some mythological events too. This is a picture of Tadodaho, who is the force of evil. But we see that he gets redeemed too, so don't worry, he's not evil for long. But he is the antagonist in the story of Hiawatha. All the tribes, the Iroquoian tribes, they're all at war with each other. Onondaga, Oneida, Seneca, blah, blah, they're all fighting with each other, and there seems to be no unity. Hiawatha comes out of the Onondaga tribe, and he says, why don't we just get along? Why don't we all get along? And there was another character that was probably historic also, called Deganawida, who was the prophet guiding spirit of unity. So Hiawatha and Deganawida together decide that they're going to confront the war guy, the guy who keeps promoting warfare, and say, let's just all get along. They see him. Oh, by the way, he has snakes coming out of his hair. I don't know if this is the right picture, but I put it in here with the idea that it depicts something like what the story relates. Hiawatha and Deganawida, and here is Tadodaho saying, no thanks, we're gonna keep fighting, go away, I'm not interested in your peace. Tadodaho does something really, really mean. He systematically kills Hiawatha's 3 daughters, one after the other. And everyone knows it's because Tadodaho has placed a curse. This is what wampum is. I probably should have put this slide later on, but let's talk about wampum. The Iroquoian people and also a lot of the Algonquian people used threaded beads as symbols of contract. Instead of signing a document, you give a piece of wampum to the person you have a contract with that might depict what it is you're agreeing to. In the simplest form, it's simply a strand. And Hiawatha and Deganawida supposedly invented this system of wampum that was a contractual agreement, and made out of these purple things. I think are quahog shells that had to have been traded from the coast in order to have arrived in upper New York State. Things like I think porcupine quills form the basis of wampum. They're called belts or necklaces or strands. So wampum is symbolic of contracts. Hiawatha and Deganawida meet up with some woman who's the great peace woman. Her name is Jikonchache. And she says, here's what we do. We need to sing a song to this Tadodaho. And when you sing the song to him, he will understand the piece. So the three of them, this picture just has the two of them going to Tadodaho. And eventually the Calumet pipe is smoked, a sign of peace also. I suppose this is supposed to be, I don't know. In fact, I don't know why they're wearing what they're wearing here. But they accomplished their goal. And Tadodaho says, well, okay, then I'm on board and I will go along with this. So they form a kind of, I guess you could sort of call it a constitution. It's the great binding law that united the 5 tribes. And this is the wampum that symbolizes the unity of the 5 tribes, dating back to when? We're going to guess sometime in the 16th century. These are the quahog beads here, and these seeds form the symbols. This is the Onondaga, and these are the other of the 5 tribes. Eventually, the Tuscarora joined them, but that was in 1722. I think the Tuscarora came up from North Carolina and joined them in New York. But the Tuscarora don't figure into this wampum. This piece of wampum is held by the Onondaga tribe to this day, and I think they keep it very secure in an undisclosed location. They don't want it to end up in museums or anywhere where they can't kind of keep control of it. There's been a lot of repatriation efforts of sacred materials from Native American tribes. And if the Smithsonian has wampum that has been subject to repatriation, I don't know, but the Museum of the American Indian and the laws regarding repatriation occurred at the same time, 1989 to 1990. So there's a lot of effort to get things back to tribes that recognize them as symbolic. Okay, what then came of this? There were some Europeans who showed up and said, you know, what these Iroquois have done is quite remarkable. And here's a guy whose book I ordered too, and it also hasn't come from Amazon yet. It's Colden, wait a minute, what is his first name? Dude, I forgot to write down his first name, but he spent a lot of time as an Indian agent in New York State and wrote down this remarkable story of Hiawatha, Daganawida, and the Great Binding Law. And this was in 1727 that he wrote all of this stuff down. Pretty soon, Benjamin Franklin read Colden, and I don't know why I picked this picture out. And I'm not sure Benjamin Franklin was an Indian agent. I might have gotten this wrong, but I read it somewhere. In any case, Benjamin Franklin read Colden and thought that this was an extraordinary thing, that the Iroquoian people had this idea of unity. Now, people credit Ben Franklin with influencing the authors of the Constitution and turning it into a kind of representational democracy. But here's what Ben Franklin said. This has a lot of pejorative language in it, but try to see what Benjamin Franklin's point was. He says, "It would be a very strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages," this is a Tuscarora have already joined, "should be capable of forming a scheme for such a union and be able to execute it in such a manner as that it has subsisted ages and appears insoluble, and yet that a like union should be impracticable for 10 or a dozen English colonies to whom it is more necessary and must be more advantageous, and who cannot be supposed to want an equal understanding of their interests. That kind of confused, but he calls them the ignorant savages, as if to sort of point out to Europeans, quit being so smug. Other people have gotten this done, and we can too. I don't know if this is an apocryphal story that Ben Franklin had a very direct connection with the writing of the Constitution, or if it just comes about as a kind of afterthought. Isn't this an interesting coincidence? I don't know. So this might be close to my last slide. Let's see what's going on here. Right. This is the last slide I have. And what has happened to the Iroquois Confederacy? This is a logo that they use on their website. The wampum pattern has been made into a flag, and there's another logo that has a quiver with a bunch of arrows in it depicting the peaceful coexistence of instruments of war in one quiver. However, there has been some strife. The French and Indian War was a 7 years war, which we fought in the 1750s and up to 1763, broke apart the Confederacy in some fairly serious ways. And the Revolution also broke apart the Confederacy. And I think that there have been some maybe mostly successful efforts to get together since then, but the actual political power and the political influence is nothing like what it used to be. They decide things like, wait a minute, now I've forgotten what it is. They decide things about heritage and repatriation and things like where collections are going to be stored. They manage to get together their agreements today. There's also some effort to develop international relations independent of the United States as a sovereign nation, and to connect with Canada in a way that allows back and forth immigration and travel without needing to go through borders. I'm not actually sure how successful all of this is, but when you go up to upstate New York, you see a lot of reverence for Hiawatha, Deganawida, and Tadodaho, because he was redeemed in the story, is now totally redeemed in political systems, and it is Tadodaho is a common name and a title in Iroquois tribes today, and Onondaga at least. Anyway, that's the end of what I have to say, and we do have some time. Is this, Sheila, supposed to be an hour long or what?
Yeah, about an hour.
Okay, we have about a few more minutes now, and yeah. I hope I can answer questions. As I say, this is not my primary research, but it's been a hobby of mine for a while.
Well, that was really interesting, Mary. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really enjoyed it. Okay, I think we are just about out of time, and I don't think we have any more questions.
Yeah, I'm glad the timing worked out. I'm never quite sure if I babble too long, run the risk of running over.
I think it worked out perfectly. I so appreciate everybody joining us today.
And thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
I'll see you again.
I hope so.
Have a great Thanksgiving. Bye.
Oh, happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Thank you. Happy and healthy one to everyone.
Yes. Okay.